Greetings, Cornerstone family. Also, greetings to those of you who are dropping in on us as well. I'm Pastor Tim at Cornerstone Baptist Church in Pine Island, Minnesota. We are going through sermon preparation progress for this week. Our text this week is Matthew 16, verses 1 through 12. And today we are looking at the structure of the text and an initial proposed outline. Let's look at the text. As we look at this, I always put the verb and verb phrases in green. I put verb modifiers in pink, and any interesting nouns in blue, and anything that really I need to research later in yellow. And so here, looking at the Pharisees and Sadducees, we see they came with a purpose to test Jesus. They're not there with open minds and open hearts. They asked him to show them a sign from heaven. And he will then point out an irony that they are spiritual leaders and they know how to discern the weather. And he will use a classical saying that's basically red skies in morning, sailor take warning kind of thing. And he will note the oddity that they know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but they cannot interpret the signs of the times. And of course, one of the things I'll be looking at this week is what signs of the time did Jesus expect them to understand? Anyway, he'll call them an evil and adulterous generation seeking for a sign, and he'll declare that no sign will be given. And then I have in yellow this week, except the sign of Jonah. And that surely refers somehow to his death, burial for 3 days, and then his resurrection, his coming out of the ground. But that's going to be an interesting thing to note this week. And then we go to the next paragraph. The disciples reach the other side, and this is going from the Decapolis last week to Magdala, and it seems like Jesus went first, and now the disciples are coming later, and it looks like they do have a problem. They had forgotten to bring bread, and so this does seem to be an oversight on the part of the disciples, and Jesus is going to say to them, watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And this begins a discussion among the disciples that they had forgotten to bring bread. Well, he's going to rebuke them, and a couple of interesting things in this rebuke that I'm seeing is he said, do you not yet perceive? There's a bit of patience that's being exercised by Jesus, that they should have perceived something by now that they had not. And he's asking him, do you not remember the 5 loaves and the 5,000, or the 7 loaves and the 4,000? And what's really interesting to me about that is that we saw the debate among scholars that the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000 was a doublet, a retelling of the same story with the facts getting wrong, but the redactors, the authors of these gospels just putting it all in there anyway. Well, here Jesus and Matthew recounts that there were 5 loaves that fed 5,000. That was 5 loaves, 2 fishes, and 7 loaves for 4,000. That was 7 loaves with a few fishes. Well, anyway, he's asking, how is it that you fail to understand? And again, we talked last week, one of the curious things about the feeding of the 4,000 was how dull the disciples seemed to be as to the solution for feeding the 4,000. And yet, even after that, they still are failing to understand who they're dealing with in Jesus to some degree. And Jesus is expressing that frustration in this text. And then he clarifies, and they begin to understand that it's the teaching of the Pharisees that they need to be careful of. So our outline, basically at this point, it just tracks the flow of the text. It may as it develops throughout the week, it may develop more and more the interpretive intent for our lives in this text. But point 1, we'll just see that the Pharisees and Sadducees came to test Jesus, asking for a sign. Jesus reflects on their ability to discern the weather, but not discern the time, or perhaps to discern spiritual timing. Jesus will condemn generations looking for signs rather than discerning the word of God in their lifetime. That's a bit of an interpretation on my part as to what he is saying there. We'll see if that holds as we unfold this passage this week. Letter C is Jesus refuses any sign but the sign of Jonah. And I'm wondering at this point, is he speaking of his 3 days and 3 nights in the grave, emerging from it in resurrection? And that's all that's left for this generation that he is addressing at this point. And that'll be a very good sign. Point number 2, next week, the disciples seem to be catching up to Jesus after his individual encounter with these Pharisees and Sadducees. He warns them about the leaven of these people, The disciples are already in an awkward position, having forgotten food provisions. It does seem to be a mistake on their part. And Jesus rebukes their lack of faith in his history with them in providing and demonstrating his ability to provide. And then Jesus is essentially rebuking the disciples there at the end for interpreting the literal ahead of his more significant metaphorical assertion. When he talks about the leaven, he's talking about something greater than physical bread. He's talking about the metaphor of teaching. And as one of my teachers always liked to say, the metaphor is greater than the reality. And it's more of the essence of what's going on. And that seems to be the case here. Anyway, we'll continue unfolding. Next will be the historical cultural data. And we'll be researching that and updating you. Thank you and have a great week.